Good afternoon, everyone. It's certainly a privilege to be talking to you this afternoon. The unfortunate bit, I think, is the fact that when you've got a topic like this, there are going to be commonalities across the speeches. But kindly bear with me if these do occur, and I will try to maybe elaborate and focus more in a local context, because it does appear that in all the discussions, particularly when Engineer Mwangi spoke about the convention center and the infrastructure around us, that a lot of the countries in Africa actually look towards South Africa as being the leader in terms of infrastructure development, what we've achieved, etc. But it's also important that we understand the landscape under which we are actually currently working and the challenges that we faced as consulting engineers in the fraternity. Oh, thank you. You might ask the question, what authority do I have to actually come and speak to you? I have been in the profession for 27 years, the last 20 of which I started my own consulting practice soon after our democracy. So in the 20 years, it's actually a journey that I've gone through. And in this presentation, I'm going to highlight some of the challenges that we as consulting engineers face in the South African context and the possible opportunities from a regional, a continent perspective, as well as possibly a global and international perspective. Very quickly, I'm going to focus on, and as I indicated, I'll try and focus on the local context with the hope of bringing in some elements that could possibly add value in an African context. And for those of you that are sitting here, I trust that there are some small business owners that would actually possibly align to some of the things I'm saying. But if not, I know that there's certainly, because the presentation that we did yesterday, there's certainly a young lady in the room that's got her own consulting practice that's just started up. So hopefully it would actually assist in helping her as well. So very briefly, that's the content of my presentation. The authority that I speak with, I've been in the industry for, as I said, 27 years, the last 20 of which I've started a small consulting practice. The reason why I put the stats there is for you to understand that even though 20 years is a long time, and you might ask why such a low turnover, you must understand that the challenges that we face in the consulting sector are actually vast and it's very complicated. And it's important for us to acknowledge that even though you might have aspirations to grow, to become a lot bigger than you currently are, it's still a huge challenge. And unless we take cognizance of that and create an enabling environment, you're not going to be growing organizations, irrespective of whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Africa, it is going to be a challenge. So you need to take cognizance of that. What gives us the market edge? I've just very briefly highlighted a few things. The reason why I've done that is because at the onset of the company, I didn't actually compromise in terms of ensuring that we had integrated systems, appropriate IT requirements, etc. So all of those things were actually executed at the onset. But with the change in technology, these things obviously pose a problem to consulting practices, small consulting practices, particularly in an African context. And one needs to take cognizance of that. When I look at the profile and the membership base locally in South Africa, as you are aware, there are a number of institutions or organizations. The two most prominent ones is CISA, who are the biggest grouping of consulting engineers, South Africa, of 530 or so members. And then there's SIPTACO, which is made up of built environment professions, a grouping of built environment professions, but their company membership base is in the order of about 20 or so, but they have a number of individual members as well. There are other associations that are also aligned in terms of the profile of the business community in consulting engineers, and there's various chambers, there's business groupings, there's diversity councils that you can become a member of. So there's a whole host of entities that are actually involved in the space of consulting engineering. I have actually taken the liberty of unpacking this a bit more so that you can understand some of the complexities associated with this in a local context. Then I've divided it into what is called categories, services, and scale. In essence, in the South African context, there's typically 4 types of businesses or categories that we are faced with. The one is organizations established pre-democracy. The ones organizations established post-democracy, and type C I've classified as organizations which we have merged post-democracy with local entities. And then you've got a type D, organizations that have acquired by international companies. You might ask the question, why have I done it like that? The reason why I've done it like that is because the needs of the country dictated the kind of company you became. So, for example, a type B company, organizations established post-democracy, which is kind of the category that I would fit into, or MPA would fit into, is ideally companies that actually evolved as a result of the need of the country at the time. So our focus area has been predominantly in terms of housing, on water, sanitation, all the basic services that would be required for the country to meet the needs of the major population that didn't have it prior to our democracy. So our organizations were very generalist in nature, and as such continued to be so. And unless you as an organization made a concerted effort to change the makeup of your company in terms of taking cognizance of what's actually happening out there with regards to the evolution of companies, you would actually be on a losing streak, because you needed to constantly evolve and to be responsive to the industry and the market. The type of service offering, as Engineer Mwangi has alluded to, is actually quite correct, and I concur with what he said. So you would have multidisciplinary services offering, but unfortunately a lot of the companies in South Africa are very specifically based. So you'd have a lot of the small companies that are very specific to civil and structural engineering, very specific to electrical, very specific to mechanical, and generally one would be partnering with them in the sense of offering your client a turnkey approach, in a multidisciplinary approach. But normally the larger consulting practices in the South African context have a multitude of skill set already. So they literally can offer a client a one-stop facility, whereas you are now competing with them and you can only offer the civil and structural, and then you've got to go to somebody else for the mechanical and engineering. So sometimes clients do not look at that favorably, but that is the reality. And obviously you'd have discipline specifics that I alluded to, and then you have highly specialized focused areas. These organizations are generally sole practitioners or companies less than about 5, and they're very, very specialized. But the dilemma with that in the South African context is these organizations, if they don't have continuity of work, are actually would not be able to sustain themselves. But because of their reputation and their brand, they've already got international partnerships with a number of other organizations, so they are able to sustain themselves in the context of the work we do. This is something that I've also put together, but there's method in my madness, and it's based on the 20 years of being in the industry. And the point I always try to make when I speak to individuals is that you cannot take the consulting engineering sector and compare it to the contracting or construction sector. The kind of individuals and the professional services that you require to run a consulting practice and the kind of turnovers you're talking about and profit margins is obviously very different. So it's important when you're unpacking this to understand the landscape we're working on, and individuals sitting here from other African countries would need to understand that it's important for you to know exactly the numbers that you have. Alison has done a lot of work on needs and numbers, so we know the number of graduates and technicians and technologists. But beyond that, it's also important to understand the kind of information that is available in the way of the practices that you're working with, the kind of specialty areas, their skill set, their employees, exactly the kind of projects that they are involved in. So in order to grow the sector, you need to know, look at a base to work from. In terms of this, I've split it up into employees, and in my definition, there's lots of definitions in the South African context regarding size of company. We've had long debates at CISA to try and quantify this and clarify it and come up with something tangible. So this is my view in terms of how this needs to be unpacked. So very quickly, in terms of the large practices, employees greater than 450, medium between 151 and 450, and small, I've got it into 2 categories. and micro, basically startups that are less than 5. Then you have the sole practitioner. Doesn't work. Okay, very quickly, what is a partnership? I just wanted to go into that quickly. It's individuals, we're looking at a pool of money, skills, and other resources. And that's the definition. So the kind of partnerships we're looking to build is a symbiotic relationship in terms of a global context, and the most beneficial one is the one of mutualism, where both parties benefit from this. The local sub-programs, it's interesting that in a local context, there's a lot of programs that government initiates. I'm going to talk very fast because I've only got 3 minutes. It relates to, it facilitates local and international partnerships on some of them, and I've unpacked them for you. And in a regional and continent perspective, there's an objective, and the outcomes would really be involved in terms of major infrastructure rollout. And basically, the 2 overriding objectives from a regional and continent perspective would be to grow the economy and have an integrated planning and management opportunities. The various outcomes are a multitude of stuff, and I'm not going to unpack that, but it can be anything from agri-processing, integration and regional sort of master planning of water. I'm going to quickly touch on the challenges and risks here, because I would like to go on to the quick wins. In terms of our challenges and risks that we currently faced with in the South African context and the kind of size we're currently practicing is underutilization of staff. We need to secure long-term appointments that generate a base income. So typically the EPCM kind of work that gives you that base income, it's not available to us as small consulting practices. If there are partnerships that are formed, they're formed with the larger organizations, so we're actually not exposed to any of that work unless somebody approaches us. Procurement and statutory obligations impact on doing business. There's definitely a procurement issue, whether it's through at a local level, a regional, or a continent level, because even on the procurement side with World Bank funded projects, DBSA funding, etc., there are targets that we cannot comply with in terms of the requirements. So that in itself poses a challenge. So you'd never get exposure to the large-scale projects. Limiting discounting and addressing non-payment issues, that's something that's common, I think, across the board. Mentoring and training has been spoken about. The fast-track approach in which we are expected to execute. Technology advances so quickly that it's practically impossible for us to outlay money to actually update on a 2-year basis. That is a huge challenge, because just when you've trained your staff on specific types of software, you've got to now reinvest in other newer, later technology. And unless you do that, you're actually going to be left behind. Governance and public sector reliance, they are falling back on their programs. There's major programs that governments have initiated to actually fast-track the process in terms of creating employment, but they're falling way behind. Creation of specialists, there's little or no opportunities to create specialists within our organizations. Although we attempt to do so, it's very limited. So any sort of partnering arrangement would actually assist in being able to promote or involve young professionals in other areas of specialization. The R&D investment, it's something that's quite common. We're doing very little of that as a country. I think that there's a lot more we need to invest in that. There's a lot of things that excite me, and I've been actively talking to some of the international universities regarding some of these initiatives. The inability to execute strategy due to internal resources. There is a limitation with small companies in the ability to actually execute strategy, because you might have a very core grouping of staff, but you don't have that sounding board like with the larger organizations where you can talk strategy and really be able to create operational plans to execute in a meaningful way. So that in itself is a challenge. The quick wins, I've just got 2 more slides. The quick wins that I propose is that there should be exchange or outreach programs that can expose staff to specialist skills. That's been alluded to. Scarce skills equals zero unemployment rate in the sector. We know that engineering is a scarce skills local, but yet it should create a zero unemployment rate in that particular sector. But the reality is that there are lots of graduates coming out of universities and technicons and are not be able to be absorbed into the market. That's a very, very sad and sorry state that we're currently in. encouraging international commitments and partnering to promote the kind of engineering that contributes to lasting development in South Africa and Africa. The reason I say that is that we constantly meet as GAMA, which is an excellent opportunity for us to get to meet each other, meet and greet, and to get involved in these discussions. But unless there's a custodian and we move forward on some of these things in a very active and a very deliberate manner, we're not going to achieve a lot. We're going to be coming back year on year and talking about these things. There needs to be somebody moving this, particularly on the policy issues related to intergovernmental talks and things. Because if it starts there, then it will infiltrate in terms of the rollout. Provide support mechanisms for SMMEs. Urgently address the procurement regime. I think there's lots of opportunities there that could actually create an enabling environment for smaller consulting practices to get involved in some of these mega projects. We really need that opportunity because at the present moment, I think a lot of smaller organizations, it's actually certainly out of their bound in order to get involved in these initiatives. Policy I spoke about, the integration of the sector. I think it's really important that we should have one voice and one mission. In the interest of the profession, in the interest of ensuring that we are actually regarded honorable as an engineer, I think it's important that we actually look to one voice and one mission. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that we all pursue initiatives in member firms, individuals, etc., but there isn't that one voice and one mission to actually bring credibility to the profession, to let our governments take us seriously, so that we can be the decision makers in terms of assisting them in making the right decisions. And I think that's just my last slide, and I just alluded to the fact that the SDG number 17 actually talks about partnerships. It's very clear on that, and in terms of what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.